Welcome to my big fat Agile Wedding, a post-mortem retrospective on one of the best and biggest days of my life thus far. Now, I had a great witty opening line for this talk back in June whilst I was 8 months pregnant. But as you have it, Agile Australia was postponed. I gave birth already. The joke no longer works. So once again, thank you, COVID, for making my life just a little bit harder this year. This talk was actually written a little after I got married in 2019. Well before this pandemic ever started, thank goodness. I'm just going to give the clicker. And even though my wedding wasn't at the mercy of the Australian government, it was still one of the most grueling projects I've ever delivered. And I've delivered projects at 2 of the big 4 banks. My name is Lucy, and I'm a Scrum Master and Agile Business Analyst, usually working technology teams building digital products. But today, I'm not going to talk to you about my tech projects, obviously, and instead, I'm going to share with you a more personal Agile experience in planning and executing my wedding. But why an Agile wedding? Well, so that I can talk about it, Agile Australia, of course. But weddings are highly complex projects. I think we can all agree that nothing is more complex than the union of 2 families. Weddings have an aggressive deadline. You've got one date to work towards that's largely unmovable. And weddings are prone to external changes. Think of all the COVID brides out there who had to reschedule their weddings. And these are all elements of a textbook Agile project. But the biggest reason why I think you need to be Agile in planning for a wedding is the fact that people planning weddings are usually doing it for the very first time. And being Agile allows accelerated learning on a project that nobody in the team has done before, because it allows teams to pivot quickly and change directions, especially when there's not a lot of knowledge in the domain. Now, even though from the outset, it's tempting to think of weddings as a waterfall project. You've got one big bang, go live date, and things happen somewhat sequentially. But like most projects that seemingly look straightforward enough to be a waterfall project, it really isn't. Treating a wedding like a waterfall project, like many of my naive girlfriends did, led to things like discovering that their newly wedded husband was allergic to the shellfish served on the day of their wedding. Yes, true story. So how does one plan an Agile wedding? For one, it doesn't just mean that we use a Kanban board, which we did, by the way, because I think the Scrum Master and me would have not tolerated much else. But it also meant that we chose wedding vendors who were more collaborative in nature and not only just wanted our business, but actually wanted to build and foster a relationship with us while planning the biggest day of our lives. Now, our Agile wedding also prioritized trialing and testing everything at every step of the way, from the food to the makeup and to the flowers, in order to avoid discovering life-threatening allergies that could ruin our big day. However, even when my husband and I subscribed to the Agile Manifesto and its values, and me having the confidence of delivering Agile projects for a living every single day, we still managed to hit roadblocks and fell into the same pitfalls that Agile teams faced in their day-to-day. So what happened? Well, throughout our wedding planning, there were plenty of disagreements between me and my husband Chris, between us and our parents. At every turn, though, I quickly noticed that nobody was really right and nobody was really wrong. We all just had a different idea of what this wedding would look like and how decisions were going to be made. You see, our parents, based on cultural traditions and how they did things at their wedding, were of opinion that a wedding is a party that they hosted and that they got to celebrate their children as we entered into this new chapter of life. On the other hand, here we thought that this was our party that we hosted, that our parents and their friends would just be merely invited to. So when we excluded our parents from critical decisions like picking out the reception venue, they quickly got very annoyed. So as part of this retrospective today, I'm going to share with you 3 lessons that I learned from planning and executing my wedding that can be hopefully applied to your real-life Agile experiences as well. So the first lesson of today is to figure out who the pigs are. Now, why is she talking about barnyard animals? Well, there's a common parable used in Agile circles, which many of you may be familiar with, about the chicken and the pig, and they want to open a breakfast restaurant, right? And they think of, what should we name this breakfast restaurant? And the chicken goes, why don't we name it Bacon and Eggs? To which the pig responds, no thanks, because that means I'm committed and you're only involved. Get it? Bacon, eggs? Yeah. So pigs represent committed individuals, people who have a stake in the success of a project. They're accountable for the final product and ultimately have the power to veto opinions and solutions they don't like or agree with. Basically, they call the shots. Usually, pigs have titles like product owner, product manager, CEO of product, or even the CEO, depending on the size of your organization. and pigs usually control the budget. So following the money is a really good way to figure out who the pigs are. Now chickens. Chickens are merely involved. Yes, chickens could appear as powerful as a pig. Heck, they might even have the title to go with it. But if a product owner has to get UX flows approved by the head of marketing, I'm sorry to say that this product owner is no more than just a chicken. Now, it's not always so simple to determine who the real pigs are in any project. In the context of my wedding, it took us a while to determine who the pigs were. And this is a common problem in every project where it isn't very clear who has the power to make decisions. And there are many possible negative consequences that happen when teams don't know who their pigs are. One possibility is that there's a power struggle where stakeholders fight day in and day out to be pigs, resulting in a priority change in the backlog every other day because everyone's trying to exert their influence. Another possibility is that the pigs are nowhere to be seen, and who you're working with are in fact a bunch of chickens in pigs' clothing, not making any real decisions because, surprise, surprise, chickens can't or don't have the power to make decisions, and the team suffers because there's no clear direction. So if you want to avoid these situations, quickly figure it out. Figure out who's the pig and who's the chicken as early as possible in every project that you're on. Because if you don't know who the pigs are, you'll just end up running around in circles like headless chooks. So sad to say, it took us about 4 months into wedding planning before we decided that Chris, our parents, and I were going to be collaborative pigs. Yes, it's okay to have more than one pig, as long as everybody knows it and they agree on it. And once this was established, it wasn't like all our problems just suddenly evaporated into thin air, but we at least knew that most big decisions will need to get agreement from all the pigs, that no one felt excluded, and this awareness also kept the power struggle somewhat in check. Now, once you figure out who the team of pigs are, what do you have to make sure happens next? Well, the next thing that needs to happen is that you need to make sure that your team of pigs stay in agreement, especially about what's important. Now, what's important, you ask? Well, that brings us to lesson number 2. It's important to know what's important, because when you're building a product or planning a wedding, there are sure to be trade-offs. We live in an imperfect world with limited constraints and limited resources and plenty of constraints. And the hardest part is deciding what's important and what's not so important together. And there are many ways to do this, right? But what I found best to work is trade-off sliders. Trade-off sliders are a great way to facilitate conversations to collectively determine what's important amongst a group of people. And although I've used it many a time in my real life projects, I'm going to be honest with you here, since this is after all a retrospective, that I did not use these sliders for my wedding. Hence why this has become a lesson. So the way these sliders work is that we draw up lines or sliders, and there we have the first of all, you create avatars first. So we have our avatars for our parents, illustrated by the elderly couple dancing over there. And then we have us as the bride and groom. Then you drop the lines for each of the trade-off item that's in contention. And on one end, you write very important. And on the other end, you write not as important. Now, the goal of the exercise is for your stakeholders to place their avatar on the line or the slider, depending on how important they think the trade-off item is. So had we used these sliders, we would have quickly discovered what each of us deemed important, and what we were willing to sacrifice was completely different. And it was precisely our conflicting priorities that became the root of many arguments that followed. Because you see, I had dreams of a wedding in the Yarra Valley, right, with sweeping views of the vineyard and an intimate party of my closest family and friends. On the other hand, my parents had this idea of a village wedding, where they wanted a venue big enough so that they can invite everybody they've ever known in this country since they arrived here 22 years ago. So the first trade-off item that we had that was in contention for us was the venue ambience. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Melbourne wedding venues, but they don't cater for very big crowds. But Chris and I wanted to prioritize venue ambience because it's really important for us. So we placed our avatar closer to the very important end of the slider. Whilst our parents, since they wanted a venue as big as possible, they were willing to sacrifice venue ambience in exchange of other things that they wanted to be, that deemed more important. Hence, their avatar is placed on the not so important end of the venue ambience slider. You get the idea, right? The only rule is that you can't place your avatar in the same position for multiple trade-off items. So at the end of the exercise, you should be able to see what each party deems to be the most important, all the way, ranked all the way to the least important. And here we can clearly see that my husband and I valued venue ambience over guest convenience, whereas our parents, who were planning to invite more elderly guests, valued guest convenience way more than venue ambience. They didn't mind not getting the sweeping views of the vineyard as long as their venue had plenty of parking and easily accessible for their guests. Now, the trade-off sliders can also reveal what we don't have to contend or argue for. In this case, all of us placed deliciousness of food as the second most important thing, which meant that we can quickly rule out venues that didn't serve good food. Now, months and months of arguments could literally have been avoided had we just used these sliders, because it would have made it very obvious from the beginning what our differences were, and it would have made it possible to talk about in a civil way that what we actually needed was a venue where ambience was still preserved without having to inconvenience the elderly guests. And we actually did end up at a venue that achieved exactly this, but we had to resolve it through arguments and tears, so much so that a mini Cold War erupted where I ended up not speaking to my mum for almost a month. So communicating what people want and achieving agreement in large project settings is one of the toughest things to do, and these sliders help turn this conversation visual and hence somewhat simpler. So we've learned that to work in a well-oiled Agile team is to first identify the pigs, your people in charge who can make decisions about what to build, and they can provide direction on the product vision. And then we have to make sure that these pigs achieve agreement about what's important and what's not so important, using trade-off sliders as one of the tools to do exactly that. And the last thing we need is actually the right mindset, because you can have the most agile team with the highest skilled people who are capable of building anything, but without the right mindset, they will fail and build nothing useful. And what is that mindset? Well, that mindset also happens to be the third lesson of today. And it is this: lose the battles, win the war. And what battles am I talking about? Well, the battle is choosing what kind of flowers go on your wedding invitation, or what shade of red you'll use for your bridesmaid dresses. The battle is the wedding, the project that must be delivered on time and on budget for launch day. But what happens after launch day? Or what happens after the wedding? Anyone? That's right, there is the marriage. And although this talk is titled My Big Fat Agile Wedding, and we've talked about all the ways in making a successful wedding in the least painful way possible, for all those who've walked down the aisle before will know that the wedding is in fact only one day. Yes, it is memorable, and yes, it is important, but it is only 24 hours of your life. The real thing is actually the marriage, the war, the product that you have to live with till death do us part. Now, most people, like most brides, sometimes forget that there is, in fact, a marriage after the wedding. Now, let me tell you that you do not want to win the battle of your wedding only to lose the war of your marriage. We know that there are plenty of people who, break up over wedding planning, just as there are companies who've quickly crumbled after they had the flashes of launch days. Because when you're building something that needs to last, like a marriage, you need to adopt a completely different mindset as to when you're building or planning something just for one day, like a wedding. And most people in their agile journeys fail to remember that the project launch day is not the end, but in fact the beginning of the product's life cycle in the wild. The lesson here is we need to opt for that long-term mindset over short-sighted plans and tactical ego wins. Our mindset needs to be that we're not planning a project, but in fact, we're building a product. Adopting a long-term mindset means that we can't afford to take shortcuts that we know will be difficult or expensive to fix later on, or make decisions that will cost us product sustainability for a quick, dirty win. And most of all, we will think twice before we risk the relationships we have with our people, especially because we need them to be working together peacefully for the long haul. When I was in wedding bridezilla mode, I nearly lost sight of the war, marriage. I was so busy perfecting the wedding that I was willing to start a fight with anyone who got in the way of my wedding vision, including my mum, my in-laws, and my husband. And the arguments were over very superficial things, like the wedding invitation, for example, which ended up in people's bins, to be quite frank with you. And here I was, willing to jeopardize these fragile relationships with the people that would be part of my life for years to come. I didn't realize that it was a bad decision to keep fighting about orchids over roses on my wedding invitation, even if it meant my mother-in-law resenting me for it. Now, luckily, I was reminded by my wise husband, no one tell him I said he was wise, that he didn't care about the details of the wedding. He didn't care what the color scheme were or what flowers went on our invitation. And he explained that it wasn't because he was just a dude that didn't care about these wedding details, but he said, as long as everybody is happy with the decisions and with each other, then that's all that matters. See, he was willing to lose the battles in order to win the war. Or he just came up with the best excuse to not get himself involved with wedding planning. As responsible Agile practitioners, our job is not only to plan and deliver a project on time and on budget, but also to build strong and resilient teams who can deliver products that are useful, scalable, and survives not only for launch day, but goes on to make the difference it promises to the world. The product you build, like a marriage, will need a lifetime of support, daily watering and maintenance by a team of people who will need to like each other enough to want to work together every day to make sure that your product serves its users. If you were to forget everything I said today and only remember one thing to take back to your real life projects tomorrow, it is this. People are what matters most. Because we all know that the most successful products usually have a high-performing team. And that's probably because its members not only care about the product, but also about each other. Now, I'm not saying we have to buy friendship bracelets or give everyone in the team commitment rings, but it's the little things we do that build great teams, like turning up on time to meetings and ceremonies, drawing diagrams and writing documentation that doesn't require a PhD to decipher, and not intentionally withholding information in order to retain power and make yourself feel important. Be that pleasant teammate to work with, one that doesn't pick a fight at every backlog refinement session or planning poker session, and be the one who strives to protect the harmony of the team above all else. And I know this is not a new concept. In fact, it says so in the Agile Manifesto that collaborations are to be prioritized over contracts. People are to be prioritized over processes. But for whatever reason, people and their relationships are almost always overlooked. But like most things in life, relationships between people need to be prioritized and preserved as much as possible. And this cannot be more true in your Agile journeys as well as my marriage. Thank you.